Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you. Muslims are currently living through one of the most challenging and difficult periods in their recent history. As we all know, Islamophobia, that can be defined as the antipathy towards Islam that results in exclusion, discrimination, misrepresentation, and stereotyping of Muslims, is currently at an all-time high. This has been empirically and independently confirmed through studies commissioned by the Southern Poverty Law Center as well as the Council of American Islamic Relations. Emblematic of this spike in Islamophobia is that since the beginning of this year, 2017, more than 24 Islamic centers across the United States have received bomb threats or have been vandalized. In the early hours of Saturday, the 28th of January 2017, the Islamic Center of Victoria in Texas was burned to the ground by unknown attackers. A day later, on Sunday, the 29th of January 2017, a lone gunman killed 6 worshippers and maimed 8 others at a Grand Mosque in Quebec, Canada. In fact, there have been also cases, at least 3 and more, in which Sikhs, members of the Sikh tradition, have been shot at and killed, and it's plausible that they were confused to having been Muslims. Never before in recent history has the Muslim commitment to a more peaceful and a just, humane world order been challenged as it is at this time. All of this means that children, they live at the cutting edge of this reality, and they are not oblivious. They are not unaffected by the toxic Islamophobic environment that we are currently experiencing. Growing up in this era fueled by hatred and bigotry can be a very daunting task. A growing number of contemporary contemporary scholars, including the French social scientist Oliver Roy, have argued that some young immigrant Muslims living in North America and Europe experience acute identity crises, which arises from the two cultural worlds in which they live, their homes and the broader society. The search for identity is further exacerbated by a growing phenomenon of Islamophobia. This toxic environment of Islamic phobia often renders these young Muslims susceptible to extremist viewpoints of Islam. Demagogues who peddle a puritanical and culture-free version of Islam, they are extremely adept at recruiting such vulnerable young Muslims, often not in mosques, but in cyberspace. Under their mentorship, these young Muslims become extremely conservative to the point that they condemn members of their own families for not being Muslim enough, and fellow Muslims at mosques for being guilty of so-called innovative or bid'ah practices. For religious leaders, and particularly Muslim religious leaders, to play a constructive role in mitigating this toxic environment in which we live, we need to do much more. And I want to conclude there. We'll have more time to discuss. For Muslim religious leaders to play a constructive role in mitigating the toxic Islamophobic environment in which we live, they need to nurture and empower young people with an inclusive spirituality that engages 4 critical orientations. So I'm speaking about an inclusive spirituality, and I'm going to speak about 4 issues. First and foremost, Muslim religious leaders should inculcate and nurture a vision and understanding of Islam as a balanced and life-affirming religion, which is called mizan in Arabic, or wasatiyya, the middle way. At the center of such a balanced and life-affirming spirituality should be the core Islamic teaching of rahmah, of compassion, mercy, and tenderness, and the understanding that spirituality known in Islamic terminology as bir, is not measured by how much you pray, how often you fast, how you dress, or your diet, but most importantly, how these acts of worship empower you, enable you to interact and to live alongside your fellow human beings with peace and mercy. So if you are praying and fasting and going on pilgrimage and Hajj, but you become an awful and hateful human being, I'm not saying what God are you worshiping. So the fruits of these worship should be seen in your character. It is the latter attributes of compassionate and righteous conduct in Islam that should form the blueprint of Islamic spirituality and our community ethos and school curricula. In such an environment and culture, children which be nurtured with the sublime values of mercy, compassion, fairness and justice, honesty and forgiveness, humility and respect. So one suggestion I have for Muslim religious leaders and educators is to create opportunities that instill these values of cosmopolitanism, of anti-racism, and of anti-bigotry. And one way is to develop excursions to places of worship of different religions among children. This could play a significant role in inculcating, edifying humanistic values. That's the first point. The second I would like to say is that there is a dire need to educate and make young Muslims aware that Islam is a culture-friendly religion, and that sound and healthy cultural values and practices should be adopted and embraced. In this regard, I would like to reference the insightful views of a Muslim scholar, Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah of Chicago. He is one of a growing number of Muslim scholars who have raised the alarm about the destructive tendency of purging religions from their indigenous cultures and practices. In his instructive essay titled Islam and the Cultural Imperative, Dr. Omar Farooq Abdullah argues that people who advocate a so-called culture-free Islam lose sight of the fact that culture is integral to the development of a healthy sense of self and community identity formation. Let me move quickly, because I don't have time, to my third suggestion. This relates to the question of the family. While we cannot insulate our families, as my brother Anand has said, we cannot insulate, and we cannot also insulate our children from the world. We need to equip them with the proper tools to navigate their way through these challenging times and to show Islamophobia the red card. We should therefore try our best, as we have said so often, to be good role models ourselves through our actions, as this is what our children see and correspondingly what they aspire to emulate and exemplify our strong identity and virtuous character. One way is also for families to be beacons of social justice activism. One of the most important ways to instill a sense of purpose and confidence in children. Last but not least, the challenge of mitigating the destructive effects of Islamophobia on Muslim children is not merely the responsibility of Muslim religious leaders, but indeed of all peace and justice-loving people. The challenge that this holds for Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, people of faith, and even people of none, is towards the building of a more welcoming environment and culture for Muslims in general and refugees in particular. The growing phenomenon of Islamophobia is engendering a fertile ground on which radical extremists they thrive. And a number of scholars, including the famous John Esposito, have said, and I quote, "If foreign policy issues are not addressed effectively, they will continue to be breeding ground for hatred and radicalism and the rise of extremist movements and recruits for the bin Ladens of this world." Interreligious activists need to join the many voices all over the world that are questioning the wisdom of the so-called war on terrorism, as we have heard Anand saying, that if state violence, if they use violence in order to solve the problem, what kind of environment are we creating? We also need to back the call for a serious reassessment of the controversial United States and Western foreign policies which abets authoritarian Muslim regimes in the Middle East and elsewhere. And this belligerent environment is currently not helpful in ameliorating the root causes and provide a fertile ground on which extremism thrives. I want to conclude by saying the challenge for Muslim religious leaders in particular is to develop what I call a theology of ta'aruf, theology of healing